So let me please welcome you to our Heuerman lecture this afternoon. We're doing this again joint with the closing of the Water for Food conference that has been in Lincoln the last several days, and we're very pleased about that. The Heuerman lectures are a signature part of the Institute of Ag and Natural Resources here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. They've been enabled over the last 6 years by a gift from the Heuerman family, longtime agriculturalists here in the state of Nebraska, Keith and Norma Heuerman of Phillips, Nebraska. Keith, unfortunately, was not able to be here today. He has one less part, he said, to tell you, and he's happy about that. He had gallbladder surgery a couple of days ago. But he is certainly with us here in spirit, and I'm sure watching streaming online. My name is Ronnie Green. I'm currently the Chancellor-elect of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and this is my last Heuerman lecture serving in the role of the Institute of Ag and Natural Resources Vice Chancellor. We're very pleased today to have with us Sally Rockey. Dr. Rockey has a long and distinguished record of service in our U.S. government, in research administration. She served for 19 years in the U.S. Department of Agriculture in various leadership roles, culminating in leading the National Research Initiative, which at that time was part of the Cooperative States Research, Education, and Extension Service, today known as NIFA, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. She left that role to go lead the extramural research programs for the National Institutes of Health, a position that she held for 5 years before 2 years ago, going on 2 years ago, almost now this summer, she joined the Foundation for Food and Ag Research, where she's serving as the executive director, the first and founding executive director of that group. The foundation was established in the 2014 Farmville, where $300 million in mandatory funding was being provided to establish the foundation that is working to develop public-private partnerships, the subject of our discussion here the last couple of days, for research in food and agriculture. So we're very pleased to welcome Sally today. She's also known as the Rock, I called her earlier today, because she's known for her Rock Talk blog that she started when she was at NIH. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sally Rockey.
Thank you so much, Ronnie, and it is really, really wonderful to be back in Nebraska, and I wanted to take this opportunity today to talk to you about our foundation, but also to talk to you about public-private partnerships and indeed about funding and technology and how we fund research in agriculture. As Ronnie had said to you, that I have a interesting past, which is a combination between the biomedical and the agricultural. So I went from the USDA to NIH. But you should know that I am an entomologist by training. So I have my PhD from TOSU, the Ohio State University. So I am all with you in the Big Ten and did my postdoctoral work at Wisconsin. So I am Big Ten born and raised. And when I moved from USDA to NIH, it was an interesting movement because I absolutely have adored working in agriculture all this time, but was very interested in learning new science when I went to NIH. But I will say that I felt, along with Charles Darwin, who said, "I am dying by inches from not having anybody to talk to about insects." That's often how I felt at NIH. But through that experience, I was able to come back into the fold of agriculture, and now I am the executive director of the Foundation for Food and Agriculture, and I'll be talking about that in a moment. So those two combinations between food and health are quite natural, because Hippocrates said, "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food." And it is absolutely true. When you think about agriculture and promoting quality of life and our health. The two are closely and knit together. And when we think about agriculture and talk about agriculture, and when we talk about things like the Farm Bill, we often talk about it as being a public health bill because these two are very closely aligned. But we really are about science here in our organization, and I have worked in the research arena for all of my years, and I am just absolutely impressed when I came back to FAR and back into the envelope of agriculture, how advanced our agricultural sciences are, how cutting edge and absolutely creative and magnificent the science has become. But the pace of technology is such that it's absolutely breathtaking what's going on now because we have this combination of knowing more about how things function and how things work, coupled with how new technologies. And when you bring those two together, science is at a pace never seen before. And so for agriculture, we want to make sure we take advantage of not only the increases to our knowledge base, but this technological pace. Now, we have, as adopters and as early adopters of many things, we have had a change over time in how quickly we adopt certain technologies. This just shows you how many years it took for 1/4 of the American population to adopt a technology after it was invented. So electricity took over 46 years, telephone 35, radio, television, et cetera, et cetera. If you go to smartphones, we're almost having a straight line. I mean, in fact, you can just envision something and it will be adopted the next day. That's how fast technology is happening. But look at where you went from no phones to landlines. This is where you hit about 100% of the population using it, to mobile phones and then to smartphones, which almost go straight up. So we are adopters. We now have an expectation that there's going to be new technologies around the corner. And we have that expectation also in agriculture, and that we're going to be able to adopt that technology to provide for a sustainable agricultural system and for a sustainable production system, as well as providing nutritious food. But there were also some skeptics, and there's been skeptics over time about technology. And just to give you some examples, and I absolutely love this one. In 1876, William Preece, who was in the British Post Office, said, "The Americans have the need of a telephone, but we do not. We have plenty of messenger boys." In 1921, David Sarnoff said, "The wireless music box has no imaginable commercial value. Who would pay for a message sent to no one in particular?" In 1946, televisions won't be able to hold any market it captures after the first 6 months. People will soon get tired of staring at a plywood box every night. 77, and you all have heard this, Ken Olsen, who is the founder of Digital Equipment, "There's no reason for any individual to have a computer in his or her home." And 1995, Robert Metcalf, who was the founder of 3Com, said, "I predict the internet will soon go spectacularly supernova, and in 1996, the next year, catastrophically collapse." But here is my absolute favorite. Even today, this is the inventor of YouTube. He said, "There's just not that many videos I want to watch." He obviously doesn't know about all those incredible cat videos that you can see every day on YouTube. But it really is amazing. But here is something we know. We know, and we don't even have we have very few doubters of this, that by the year 2050, we are going to have to feed 9.5 billion people in this world. And so we need our agriculture and our agricultural research to keep up, to be able to provide that food that is going to be needed for this enormous population that we're going to have worldwide. So I want to talk to you a little bit about funding for agriculture, and that how stagnant funding has actually led to new opportunity models and new models for funding and new opportunities for ag research. So let me show you this slide. It's a little bit hard for you to see, but this is trends of R&D by agency. Now, in most cases on these kind of slides, you take out DOD, which is the Department of Defense, because DOD tends to overwhelm and dilute the rest of the funding because they have so much money for R&D. But if you look at the other aspects of above the red line, so up to the red line is DOD, then you have the NIH, which it composes 50% of the remaining 50% of the funds, NSF, DOE, Department of Energy, and at the top you have the USDA. Not the very top, that's all others, but that little slice, I might be able to point to it here. This little slice here is the USDA. So of the entire R&D budget, the USDA comprises 2% of the R&D budget. Of the non-DoD budget, USDA is about 4.5% to 5% of the non-DoD discretionary budget. So if you look also at within USDA, how do they fund their research within the USDA? So much of it is through the intramural program. That is the program where we have government employees conducting research. That's primarily through the Agricultural Research Service, which you have here, and you have many other places around the country that do really spectacular work that oftentimes is very relevant to local issues in agriculture. And then you have the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, which is NIFA, that any of you that compete for funding know that this is the spot where you have a broad-based competitive program where people can compete from around the country in areas that are relevant to agriculture. But if you look at this mixture compared to the agency that I came from, which was the NIH has $32 billion of research each year. And this is biomedical research, some of which is relevant to agriculture, for example, in the areas of nutrition and food safety, et cetera. So there is some research there that's relevant to agriculture. But they do it quite differently. They have a small 10% of their budget is intramural, and 84% of their budget is extramural. So the vast majority of their money goes out to capture the experts from around the country to work on issues of biomedical importance. At the USDA, it's a little over half is intramural and the other half is extramural. So for people around the country, that also it means that there's less money to generally compete for at the USDA. So whenever I gave talks at NIH about what research has done to people's lives and the impact on people's lives, I used this chart. But even when I was at NIH, I many times would give props to agriculture because of this chart. This is a chart of life expectancy from the year 1900 to today. And if you were born in 1900, your life expectancy in this country was about 48. And if you look at what happens over time, life expectancy today is just under 80. For women, it's slightly over 80. Men, slightly under 80. That drop let me go backwards here. That drop you see here, that was the 1917 flu. So those of you that are working in infectious disease at the intersection of human and animal health and are very familiar with what these kind of infectious diseases can do. But this is because of biomedical research and all the advances we've made in medicine. But what I contend at least 50% of this life expectancy is due to agriculture for two reasons. One is that we eat more nutritious food, and secondly, we generally control foodborne pathogens. And that has made a lot of difference because that impacted people's lives for many outbreaks as we went along as a society of foodborne pathogens. And this is the power of research. So the question then is, why is agriculture research funded not commensurate with its values to improving the quality of life? You know, I dreamt about the idea of coming at NIH and having an agricultural structure that had $32 billion of funding. And I think about that Dr. Seuss book, All the Places We Could Go, or something like that. Just imagine where we could go if we had that kind of funding. But Kurt Vonnegut probably said it best. Practically speaking, when it comes right down to it, food is practically the whole story every time. So when we think about our world, our society, and the parts that food has played on developing our society and the construction of our society as we know it today, food has made an enormous difference. So, but there's a lot of hope, I think, for what's happening in ag research. And I point out there that we had Nebraska, who just mentioned about the support of research here in Nebraska. We've had many other groups that have talked about it. We had a New York Times article, editorial just a few months ago about we need a new green revolution and we really need to put our money behind our words, which is to fund agricultural research. We've also seen quite a bit of advocacy that's growing up around funding agriculture research. We have the Council for Agriculture Science and Technology, the Council for Food and Agriculture and Resource Economics. At the National Academy of Sciences, we have the Board on Agriculture and Natural Resources. We have some new organizations whose sole job is to promote evidence-based policy in agriculture. Agree is one of them, and Supporters of Agriculture Research, who work to advocate for the competitive grants programs in agriculture. And then we also have, really exciting for next year, the doubling of the AFRI budget in the 2017 budget. The AFRI budget has experienced some increases, but this is an effort to actually bring it to the level it was appropriated at, and which basically doubles that budget, the competitive grants program. I would contend that's still a drop in the bucket, but this is fantastic news on a path forward to increasing funding in agriculture. And then last but not least, we had the FAR, which was in the 2014 Farmville, the creation of my organization, and I want to tell you just a few minutes about it and then talk to you about a few other things. So our mission as an organization is to build unique partnerships to support innovative science addressing today's food and agricultural challenges. And we are a 501c3, which means we are a nonprofit charitable, and we are we are not USDA, but we are aligned with the USDA. So like a number of other government agencies have 501c3s associated with them. And the idea here with behind a 501c3 that is associated with a government agency is to allow us to establish these public-private partnerships that further the missions of the agencies. So we have a 20-member board chaired by former Secretary Dan Glickman. And we have 5 ex officio members on our board, which include the Secretary of Agriculture, along with the head of NSF, because we know that science now is very multidisciplinary, and NSF on a very basic level funds quite a bit of research that is very relevant to agriculture. Kathy Rotecki, who's the chief scientist, Sunny Ramaswamy, who's the head of NIFA, and then Shavonda Jacobs-Young, who is the head of the intramural program, ARS. And then we have 14 voting members who are all composed of industry, academia, nonprofits, other nonprofits, a producer, and others on our board. And they are a fantastic board. This board is so active, and they are so dedicated to seeing that our organization succeeds. So how are we going to work? We are going to fund cutting-edge research and development through grants and challenges. So our acronym is FFAR, but we say FAR, and the reason we say FAR is we have a motto, which I love, which is best science by far. And if it was FAR, it wouldn't make much sense. So we say FAR. We are going to be laser focused. Now we have $200 million. We received a gracious gift from you, the American taxpayer, when we were authorized of $200 million. There's very few foundations that start off with that base of $200 million. But yet that is, and we're going to leverage another $200 million with that funding. But yet that's a drop in the bucket compared to what the USDA spends on agricultural research and what the nation spends on research in general. So for us, we have to be laser focused on finding gaps and white spaces where we can really propel science forward and propel science towards application. So we're going to be seeking those gaps and white spaces. We're going to build these unique public-private partnerships, which I'll talk about in a moment. And another issue is we're going to convene stakeholders and thought leaders to foster collaboration and help us define our programming. And that is why tomorrow we are going to have the first of our convening events, which is around the issue of water and big data. That is a continuation of the previous talks that you heard here today. And this is really to bring people together to address issues where we can come out with some sort of roadmap to addressing those issues in the future. And we're also going to build human capacity. As part of our authorization, we are to support the next generation of agricultural scientists. So that's very important to us. And we are not all about biology, folks. We're about the physical, social sciences, economics. We want to bring all of the different pieces of science together that can be instrumental to seeking answers to particularly interesting challenges in agriculture. So public-private partnership is our model, but we are required to have matching funds before we can deploy our funds. So this is a unique challenge for us because we're a new organization, so we have a big carrot, right? We have our $200 million. But in order to spend those dollars, we have to attract our partners and our donors and our sponsors. And so it's a little bit of a circular argument because they oftentimes want to see how you're functioning and how you're going to work, and they want to see some product before they're willing to invest in you, and we can't deliver any product until we get a match. So it's a little bit of the circular notion that you have, but we're up to this challenge. We've already been very lucky to have a number of groups that have supported us on our projects, and we're moving forward. The other issue for us is that we have to work extremely close with the USDA because we are not to simply extend or duplicate what they do. We are to complement what they do. And so we have to have a good relationship so that we can understand what they're working on, where they see the white spaces are, and how we can help fill those white spaces to further their mission. So as part of our authorization, we are to further the mission of the USDA. So here's our areas. Our board worked very hard before I even got here to put these areas together. And all of them, they're very broad. And so it's unlikely that we're going to have a competitive program just in one of these areas. We're going to be more laser focused on components of these areas. But they range all the way from optimizing agricultural water use, very relevant to this, to spurring post-harvest food system innovation. And we go the gamut between animals and plants, sustainable systems, natural resources. We're interested in soils, healthy food choices, looking at processing, food processing, et cetera. So this is very, very broad. And again, this lends itself to the notion that we have to be laser focused because we are so broad that if we are too broad, we will dilute the impact that we could have. So let me just talk to you about a couple programs that we've launched. We've launched 4 programs or about to launch 4 programs. The first is a rapid response program where we understand, because we're an organization that it can be nimble since we're a foundation, that we could throw some money at issues where there is an emerging or re-emerging disease or pest and that is acute national and has tangible outcomes. So in other words, is there something emerging where we can place some money along with some partnership to address this issue quite quickly? One of the issues for us, though, in this program is the match, because we have to have a match. And how can you be rapid if you have to have the match in front of you? So we're working out ways to accumulate that match ahead of time so when we launch the program, we can move right into it and fund some extraordinarily important studies. The second is the national prize. So as I said to you earlier, agricultural sciences are very cutting edge today, a sophisticated science. But at the National Academy of Sciences, there has never been an award that awards a researcher in ag and food sciences. It's not that there haven't been ag or food scientists that have won, or there have been ag and food scientists that have won prizes at the Academy, but there's never been a designated prize. And we think this is a great way to bring visibility to what the science in agriculture is all about within the whole realm of science. So this is a program that we are launching with Bill and Melinda Gates, and it is a $100,000 award to a mid-career scientist. We want to recognize those persons' accomplishments, and then we want them to go off and prosper and continue contributing scientifically after they win this prize. So it's going to be a mid-career. It will be announced this summer, and we will be taking nominations this fall, and we will confer the first prize next year in 2017. So this is a great day for agriculture. It's really going to be a wonderful a recognition of a highly talented individual who's had a contribution. Remember that I told you we are about supporting the next generation of scientists, so we have launched a new Innovator Award program to support people in their early faculty positions. We have the applications in right now, and with this particular program, the universities are coming up with the match for us, so thank you very much for the universities to do that. And we will give them a quite substantial prize because as I noted earlier, since there's not a lot of competitive grants to go after, oftentimes scientists in agriculture, they're entrepreneurs. They're going to set their research towards the directions where they can receive funding. So we want to make sure that as far as taxpayer dollars, that they're firmly implanted in agriculture. So we're going to give them a quite significant prize to conduct a creative research. And finally, we are establishing a national consortium on soil health. We have a very gracious partner in this, which is the H.G. Buffett Foundation and ourselves, where we're going to set up not only a network that would include field trials, but also a set of competitive grants that we are going to run to put some money on some very important research. And we have a very practical outcome for this research. We want to increase the amount of acreage that uses soil health promoting practices by 5 million at the end of this project. So in this particular case, again, our research is going to have to be focused on our ultimate outcome, but it may be both basic and applied depending on how we construct it. So let me talk about, again, the idea of finding the gap, and in this case, minding the gap. What seminal pieces of research can we do to move forward? And I want to just talk about an example. So you know that we use antibiotics to promote animal growth. And we discovered that antibiotics promoted growth back in 1948. So these two individuals that worked for the Letterl company, I'm not pronouncing that correctly, they worked on a variety of vitamin B, which they believed was the animal factor that promoted growth. And so they were the first lab that discovered tetracycline. So they were using streptomyces to produce the antibiotic aramycin. And when they produced that antibiotic, what they would do is they would raise the streptomyces, and then they would remove the antibiotic and extract the antibiotic, and then you had all the basically the remains of the bacteria. And they realized that the remains of the bacteria contained a lot of B12. So they decided they were going to use that to collect the B12 that they needed. And they did an experiment where they put the B12 in chickens, in chicks, along with some liver extract, and they discovered that the B12 that had come from the streptomyces caused enormous growth, 24% higher growth. And then they realized that it was not the B12 that was causing the growth, but in fact the residues of the antibiotic that was in the bacterial carcasses. So that was done in 1948, and we have been using antibiotics ever since. And we know now we're under dire straits because the use of antibiotics is going to be coming to an end. And we have to find alternatives to this. But do we know how this works? Do we know why antibiotics cause growth in animals? We know some things, but these are all the theories. I'm not going to go through them all. These are all the theories of how antibiotics work to promote growth in animals. And of course, it depends on the type of animal and the system that you're using, et cetera. But it makes a point. If we're going to think about alternatives to antibiotics, and we don't even know really how those antibiotics work, wouldn't it be great to finally really definitively understand how they work so that we can develop the antibiotics in a way that is based on scientific understanding. So that's just an example that we think about when we think about those gap areas that would help promote our understanding and then lead to some applied outcome. So here's a bunch of other things that we're interested in. As of course you see on there, big data and water, pollinators, et cetera. And all of work on some breeding technologies and the next generation of breeding technologies, foodborne illnesses. We're looking at phenotyping networks. Phenotyping is the next great frontier, and we're looking at how to set up a national phenotyping network. And then we're looking at next generation tools, genetic tools that we might use for plant breeding, and looking at public opinion. And why are we going to do this? Well, you all know our situation with GMOs. Whether you're for or against GMOs, there's been a lot of discussion over the years. We've been using GMOs for 25 years in agriculture, and the case for GMOs has not been settled, at least in public opinion. And we really want to get ahead of that when we launch these next generation technologies that are going to be important to us for breeding. So for example, we have our new gene editing technologies. What does that mean? Is that a GMO? Does it have to be regulated in the same way that GMOs, or labeled in the same ways that GMOs might be labeled? And when we think about understanding public opinion, there's a lot of things that we need to think about. There's a great disconnect between scientists and the public oftentimes. And I love this cup. Everyone is entitled to my opinion. And my husband would certainly say that about me, that's for sure. But there was just a new poll that looked at some hotly debated scientific issues. And it was surprising, the disconnect between scientists. So they surveyed both scientists and then they surveyed the public. And 50% of the public and 87% of scientists say that climate change is mostly due to human activity. 65% of the public and 98% of scientists say humans have evolved over time. 37% of the public and 88% of scientists say it's safe to eat GM foods. This is a huge disconnect here. 47% of the public and 89% of scientists favor the use of animals in research. So we oftentimes as scientists use the data, now I'm going to lose the term of it, the data dump, I guess it is, model. In our opinion, we think that the more data we provide to the public means that they're going to come to our way of thinking. So the or the deficit model, this is called. So we believe that the reason that the public doesn't align with our thinking scientifically is because they don't have enough information. They don't have enough data. So we continually give them more and more data with the thought that somehow this is going to change their mind, and then this is what the context of this this deficit model is all about. That seldom works. This is not the reason people believe the things that they do. It also is disrespectful of people in the way that they think. We as scientists have to know that people think differently than ours, and what is it going to take to convince them? It's not about giving them more data. So we're thinking about how we can manage this for technologies that are important to agriculture, where there is a lot of difference in public opinion about many issues in agriculture. And so we want to do a better job of being proactive and working with the public and understanding their reasoning and thinking so that we can stave off some of the issues that might come forth in the future. So these are the kind of groups that are going to be our partners. It ranges from anybody who wants to be in a public partnership, including food companies, seed and chemical companies, equipment companies, universities, research institutions, commodity groups, associations, NGOs, and also international groups. We have met almost literally in the 6 months that I've been with FAR, we have met almost literally with each and every one of these groups in the world, I think. And based on the number of business cards I have in my desk, I'd say it's thousands of people in the last 6 months. And the thing that strikes me is this great partnership that is already going on in agriculture. Because of the way agriculture is funded, it has led to two things. One is that it is hard. It has led us to be entrepreneurs and to really develop these relationships with other sectors and with other funders and develop actual partnerships and working towards common goals that would never be seen in another area like biomedical. This is just absolutely incredible what's gone on in agriculture. But at the same time, because of the way that funding is very diversified, we oftentimes have many activities going on in the same area and we don't know about each other. So we have big data initiatives everywhere. We have initiatives on looking at phenotyping everywhere. And so we as an organization want to bring these groups together and so we can have a more consistent look and some rhyme and reason to some of the things that we do. So why do we engage industry? Well, there has been a shift in funding for R&D by industry over the years. So this is just a national R&D by funder. These are expenditures in billions, and this is for all science. Now remember, with the Defense Department industry in there, you're going to have that big space. But so this shows you how industry has more and more proportionally funded science in this country. This is agriculture. This is the best I could do, which was in 2009. But we do know in agriculture that the amount of support for R&D in agriculture is growing on the industrial side, and it eclipses the federal and the public funding of agriculture. So there's where the action is, folks. We need to continue to move in that arena, not only because we share goals with the private sector, but because that's also a place where there could be joint funding of research. So we also want to work in the pre-competitive space. That's what we always talk about with public-private partnerships, that we want to work in the pre-competitive space. So I wanted to know what this meant, because we talk about it all the time. And we all know what it is. And so I went and I looked for a definition of pre-competitive space. Nothing's coming up, and that's because there's no definition. Okay. So, but I did find, interestingly enough, a definition of the competitive space. So here's the definition of the competitive space. Areas of business in which a firm feels comfortable against competitive pressures on the basis of its cost advantage and or technological leadership. So they feel comfortable competing. So I thought, well, maybe I could make a definition by simply taking those blue words and putting the opposite in. And this is what happened. Areas of business in which a firm feels uncomfortable against unambitious relaxation on the basis of its cost disadvantage and or technological inferiority. Don't think that works, folks. Don't try this at home. Just don't substitute words. It doesn't work. So I thought a lot about it, and I came up with a definition. Also, I went out and I queried my very fictitious friends to find out if they had a definition or knew anything about it. And my first fictitious friend said, we'll know it when we see it. My second fictitious friend said, whatever it is, it needs an IP agreement. Thirdly, let's see if our lawyers can define it for us. Well, it's certainly not out in the field. And then finally, pre-competitive, isn't that code for bring along your checkbook? So, but nonetheless, I came up with a definition which basically says area of research where outcomes offer no particular advantage relative to peers and where there is a potential to positively impact all parties equally, allows resource and data to be readily shared. So this is a very broad definition. I think in agriculture, it's oftentimes that companies in particular work in the pre-competitive space and then move back to the competitive space and then back out to the pre-competitive space. So it's just not a natural defined line between the pre-competitive space and the competitive space. But nonetheless, that's the area that we want to work. So why do we have incentives for private sectors to work in this space? Well, of course, most companies feel there's a corporate social responsibility. They can more rapidly develop products where there are common obstacles to advancement. So if there's something that's shared within the industry that would help all if we achieved or were able to address that particular concern, would mean that they could work in the pre-competitive space together. Of course, working together means there's cost savings. They get direct access to important fundamental research. So generally, working in the pre-competitive space, they're using all the great knowledge that is generated by a university to bring it to bear on particular issues. They have access to academic expertise and excellence, and they bring in students and trainees. So there's a lot of advantages for the private sector to work. For the public sector, we're addressing real-world problems when we work in this space. We generate research that is transferred quickly to the economy. We get access to resource and data that would otherwise be unattainable, and this is a trick of working in this space. And we also get access to their excellent scientists as well. So it's a really win-win situation for both sides. I will tell you that my general notion, having worked at NIH for 11 years and then coming back into agriculture, is that in the biomedical world, with the pharmaceutical companies who are many large pharmaceutical companies, but they have all the same goal, which is basically to produce new drugs. Whereas in agriculture, we have seed companies and chemical companies, and we have food companies, and they're very diverse. And so I think it's quite different working in the competitive space with the diversity of our sector here. But at NIH, we were able to bring the pharmaceutical companies in quite often together to work in the pre-competitive space, and I think agriculture is moving very rapidly towards that notion as well. So how do we make these things work? First of all, we have to have shared goals. So between the private and the public, we have to have shared goals. If we didn't have shared goals, we wouldn't be developing a public-private partnership. We have to have shared values. And so this is really important because sometimes, especially from the outside, it looks like industry may have different values than a university. But when we come into that public-private, and I'm not debating whether that's true or not, I don't necessarily believe it is, but when we come together in the public-private space, we have to have shared values and we have to be honest with each other in order to make this work. We have to have agreement on responsibilities and rules of engagement. There's nothing that can explode or implode a public-private partnership if we don't have clearly laid out rules of engagement and how we're going to agree on what each of our responsibilities are. We have to have a transparent value proposition for each partner. So this doesn't mean money. So it does not mean that I'm going to make this amount of money, but I'm getting value out of this partnership, as are you. And we have to know what the value of this is for each of us. And that's a trust factor. We have to work in synergy. This means that you put a public-private partnership together when you couldn't achieve it any other way by putting the partnership together or working alone. And we have to have skin in the game from everyone. So if there's an imbalance, this is not going to work. So everyone has to contribute in some way. And finally, two things very important: joint celebration of success, but also shared responsibility for failures. And this oftentimes does break down these partnerships, so we want to have both the success and the failures. So we talked about the water food nexus today, and I just want to mention very quickly that this is an area that is just primed for public-private partnerships, and we're seeing them develop all the time in the water world, in the water food world. And the reason being is because working on water and the food nexus means that it crosses research disciplines: agriculture, soils, natural resources, economics, computational sciences, engineering, all of the things that need to come together. And we talked about an example here where we're bringing the computational sciences in big data area to work on issues in water. We cross all the sectors: food, chemical, and energy industries, which allows the companies to work together in the pre-competitive space and different companies from different sectors. We impact across fields, landscapes, states, regions, and major focus globally. So the lessons that we learn, as we talked about, and we heard Uma talk about, things that we learned in Nebraska can be applied to sub-Saharan Africa or other places. And involves individual producers, landowners, land managers, natural resource managers. And so all of these people have to come together for those shared goals. So I think in the water food nexus, this is an absolute excellent place to foster these public-private partnerships. So I just want to end by just some of the things that we talked about, and I'd love to talk and hear your comments and thoughts about some of these. But we must grow funding for agri and food research, whether it be by new funding, which would be all of our dreams, but also by establishing relationships which generate funding for our research. We must always articulate how agriculture contributes to health and quality of life. It's very, very important, that message. We must develop partnerships and public-private partnerships that bring research results into the public domain that can be used by all and are the benefit of all. We must understand how social issues drive. I didn't talk much about this, but you talked about it certainly on your panel, how social issues drive the food and agricultural systems, and include it in our research objectives from the very onset, including incentives, how we fund research, human behavior, community dynamics, and economic drivers. All of those things should be embedded in how we go forth, particularly in our public-private partnerships. And then we must tell the story and communicate science to engage the public respectfully. That's really, really important. And finally, I just say, keep the creativity going. It is just amazing, as I've traveled around the country, to see all the pent-up need for agricultural research funds, because the ideas and the innovations are absolutely incredible. I almost want to cry, because as an organization that I lead, I would like to fund each and every one of you. The ideas are spectacular. So just keep that going, and we will always remain at the cutting edge. So thanks so much. You want to sit at the table? Or?
Yeah, if you want to, why don't you do that? So we've got time for some floor dialogue and questions from the floor with Dr. Rockey. So there are mics in the center as we've had throughout the conference the last couple of days. And who would like to ask the first question?
Did you have any water? I need a mic.
Yes.
Very nice talk. I really enjoyed them. And I'm going to ask you a question going back to one of your first slides. When you show how the improvement of technology somehow have been, you track those improvement of technologies from the electricity to the internet.
And the adoption of the technology,
Yeah,
right.
exactly. And that's a very fantastic plot because it shows as well how the intellect of the human being has progressed. But if we look into how we are training our students, for example, or how we were trained, there is somehow a kind of a gap between how we assimilate knowledge and how we are transmitting this knowledge to put into the action to what the technology is. And I'm not sure if I'm phrasing it properly. The rate at which we learn and the rate at which the information is needed now is different. How we can merge or help to embrace these kind of challenges of how we learn and we are teaching to the new generation with these new tools.
Yeah,
And and how we move this into transforming research into operations and into a societal benefit?
It's a great question, and I will say that frankly, there's that chart I showed, which the adoption of technology, there's some debate. There were things that were conveniently left out, like the refrigerator. The refrigerator was like the smartphone of our time. Once people got knowledge of a refrigerator, they took refrigerators and ice boxes just disappeared almost overnight. So it's a little selective there. But your point's very well taken. One of the things, too, about the adoption of technology is that technology itself allows you to more quickly adopt the next technology, right? So we have social media, we have television, we have radio, we have ways to communicate with people. So even finding out about a technology is instantaneous, where in 1900, you wouldn't find out about a technology unless your neighbor happened to have it. So technology breeds more quick adoption of technology. But I think your point is really well taken about how we train this generation to be at the forefront of taking advantage of technological advances. And I think a lot of groups do it, including here at the University of Nebraska. And it's partially in the types of training that you get. So I have seen over my course of my 30 years in government, the training that students get both in agriculture and in my case in biomedical research is so much more diversified now than it was in the past. So you are expected to not be a person that works on one project and only gains one skill during the course of even your undergraduate and or graduate training. You're expected to, for example, many students have to take computational sciences or learn how to work with big data. If you're in the biological sciences, in agriculture, you might have to take an ag engineering course or something else. I think that's our best defense against that. It is true that when you have a whole host of people in an area, you're able to incrementally move forward the more people you have because they're all contributing. But nonetheless, I think our ability now to train students, and it's not just about the scientific disciplines they're doing, it's about their other skills. So I'll tell you just an interesting story. When we were in NIH, I did a very long and very impactful study of the biomedical workforce. And most people that are in PhDs that are working in biomedicine all want to become professors. And when we did the data, when we looked at those data, it turns out that only 44% of PhDs in biomedicine ended up as faculty positions, and only half of them were actual tenure-track faculty. So we need to train students for this broad swath of types of experiences and actual jobs they're going to get. So we were just talking to an individual here today who works in business and ag. Was it ag business? I think it was. And he had interest in becoming an entrepreneur, Many people now, and students in particular, are interested in this. So do we give people business skills? Do we give people entrepreneur skills? Do we give people a chance to work in industry under different time frames and a different focus? All those kind of things. I think both of those are really important. Not only multidisciplinary in science, but just your wealth of experiences.
W. Don up in the back.
How do you accomplish all these ambitious and idealistic goals without neutralizing the effect that the commodity titles and the conservation titles in the United States Farm Bill have on my behavior as a producer?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's also a really difficult task. So I think generally in science, to the degree that science can inform policy, that is one of our most important roles. We as scientists and we in the scientific energy, in the enterprise, are expected to produce science and data and results that can be used as evidence-based policy development. But does it always happen? It doesn't always happen. And and much of our economic data, particularly in some of the rules and regulations that govern, or the environmental rules and regulations that govern farmers and their farms, are often difficult to place the right kind of science to get it to where it needs to be. So it's a huge issue. I don't think I have all the answers to that. I just would plead that we all try to think about whatever capacity, whether it's economic research, social science research, agricultural research in plant breeding or other areas, that we use that as evidence-based for our policy development. You know, I usually show a slide of the Farm Bill and all of the controversies that surround the Farm Bill. I mean, the Farm Bill, it's a public health bill, it's a commodity support bill, it's a research funding bill, it's all sorts of different things. And do we get it right all the time? I don't think so. It's so complex that we often lose sight of the forest through the trees, because we have to deal with each and every issue within the Farm Bill. And so my plea is, let's do the science that we need to do, or at least have the policy development that we do that is based on evidence. And whatever's happening on the farm, we should use those as those data and that information also to direct our Farm Bill. But you know, the politics of the Farm Bill are enormous, and it's an important bill that comes forth every 5 years. And I would hope that we can do what we can do at the foundation to generate some useful information that's going to be used in the Farm Bill to make it an evidence-based bill.
Prem up in the back.
Sally, excellent presentation, great work in a short time, and developed a very important agenda. So I have a couple of questions that kind of related. One is that it seems like similar to NIFA and other grants, or at least other than that's a private-public partnership. I was hoping that there would be opportunities for some larger centers of excellence. You know, the major need is infrastructure, and especially with a partnership, you know, like the Water for Food Institute, with a $50 million gift. I mean, then you can at least start to address some of the questions which are important. Are there plans over the longer period to have maybe perhaps a focused agenda, but also larger centers of excellence grants?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure it'll be centers of excellence, and again, we are only $200 million, although we plan to generate funds on top of that as well. But for example, the Soils Health Initiative is going to be a $25 million initiative, so it's not going to be small. And it does have somewhat of a center-like focus in that it's a network and a consortium of people working together. I think for a foundation to set up a large infrastructure, especially a new foundation, is a little risky because we don't know where we will be in 5 years. But I do think there's opportunity for larger grants. It's not going to be all investigator-initiated science. We might have some programs where you can compete, but even with those programs, it's going to be more on the applied end. We also can directly fund, where we see a great relationship between some universities and private sector and the government, we can directly fund those without a competition. So because we are a foundation and we can pick and choose what we want to fund. But I think we're on the margins of that. I wouldn't definitively say that we're going to fund a big center like this, but we will have some larger grants and some larger network consortium kind of grants.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think what Prem was trying to say is he counted 5 things up there that should come to the University of Nebraska. But anyway.
I know. And whenever I go to a land grant university, like one as powerful as Nebraska, I'm like, we should just move our foundation here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we have another question up in the back.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Rockey, for your informative presentation. One slide that really struck me was you had a kind of a laundry list of things that need to be in place for a public and private partnership to work, and a number of things that needed to be reconciled. One thing that I didn't see were the very different timelines that are often in place if you look at academia versus private industry. So what are the foundation's plans for helping bridge that gap in terms of the disparate timelines between the two entities?
I think that when you set out the goals of any particular project, you can set the timelines. I will admit, though, that in general, private-public partnerships that work in the pre-competitive space, they're in it for the long term. I mean, industry has to accept the fact that when they enter a private-public partnership in that pre-competitive space, that's a longer term than their typical projects might be. So, I think it's very dependent on the project. In our case, in the case of the Soil Health Initiative, where we have a very practical outcome, in some ways that's very scary because it's a very concrete outcome. But one of the most important things in a private-public partnership is to set the milestones and benchmarks. We heard a little bit about benchmarking early in the big data, but the milestones for this, there always has to be very clearly defined milestones for any project like that, which I think allows you to negotiate those timelines at the very onset. And so we would hope that all of our agreements would have that negotiated timeline.
Helen?
I just have a clarifying question. Is your organization just focused on US-based research, or how does it work in a global sphere?
Yeah, no, we are not US-based. We've been working with many of our partners, like FAO and others who work internationally. Of course, Gates works internationally as well, and many of our other NGOs work internationally. So we can work internationally. We can fund internationally. We actually can accept match from other governments. We can't accept it from the federal government, but we can accept it from other governments. So our match is non-federal. So we expect, because agriculture is global and the issues of feeding 9.5 billion people is going to depend on our ability to produce sustainable systems across the world, that we'll be working international as well.
Andy Benson.
Sally, at the end of the day, we can do all the science we want to do and even try and communicate it, but at the end of the day, markets and policy are going to drive adoption.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen anybody yet get their arms around how we deal with that. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it also went to this gentleman's point about the Farmville and other things that are happening there. So yes, you're exactly right. So one of the things to understand is incentives, and the Field to Markets group, which is the group that's working with many of the industry across the country, and thinking about how you would do things, for example, like setting up systems where there's points for sustainable production. So somehow you're going to craft a new system where you're going to get a price point based on your sustainable production, and how you would do that, how you would monitor it. It's really important to understand those market forces. I mean, you're right. You can do science, till you're blue in the face, but if the market's not going to adopt it. So we have to understand what drives the farmers, what drives economically, socially, also what are other factors beyond that may be limiting adoption, and understand it both on the individual farm level and on the community level as well. So we're willing to, we and the foundation are very interested in some of the work that's going on incentives and how we promote incentives and how we get some of these new practices to be adopted. So we're interested in actually doing research in that area and also having that research find its way out into the real world. Any
final questions for Sally? Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Rockey for a great dialogue.
Thank you very much.
And Sally, we have a tradition in the Heuerman lectures
that's
of
fantastic.
leaving a medal with our lecturers who come from around the world. So we're very pleased
That's
to present
wonderful.
that to
Thank
you
you
on
so
behalf
much.
of the university, and thank you
Thank you
very
so
much
much.
for
That's wonderful.
being here.
Thank you.
Well, we'll look forward to the Heuerman lectures kicking off again in the fall. The lecture series will be publicized later in the summer, so we hope you'll join us in that next year.